There is a fundamental misunderstanding about what an empath actually is and what their light truly represents in daily life. Most people tend to think of it as kindness, warmth, or deep emotional sensitivity. And while those qualities are certainly part of the experience, they are only the surface level. At its core, an empathic light is awareness itself. It is pure perception and the unique ability to see what is actually there without distortion, without denial, and without the heavy layers of self-deception that most people rely on just to stay comfortable through the day. And that exact clarity is where the tension always begins. Because when you carry that high level of awareness, you do not just see the beauty in the world, you also see the contradictions. You see when someone says one thing out loud but feels an entirely different way underneath. You notice the subtle shifts in their vocal tone, the hesitation in their words, and the heavy emotional undercurrents they are desperately trying to suppress. You pick up on what remains unresolved, what is hidden in the shadows, and what people actively try to avoid. And the most important part of this dynamic is that you do not even have to point it out to them. You do not have to confront them or make a scene, because your mere presence alone is enough to trigger it. That is what people react to so strongly. Most individuals spend a significant portion of their waking lives managing internal discomfort by simply avoiding it at all costs. They build entire identities around who they think they are rather than who they actually are in reality. They create elaborate narratives that protect their fragile ego, justify their questionable behavior, and keep their deeper insecurities safely buried away. This pattern is not necessarily malicious, because that is simply how human psychology works as a defensive mechanism, but it always comes at a high cost. It requires constant maintenance, constant denial, and constant reinforcement to keep those illusions intact. Now imagine introducing an empath into that delicate environment. An empath does not play by those unspoken rules, not because they are actively trying to disrupt anything or cause trouble, but simply because they cannot unsee what is right in front of them. Their natural awareness cuts straight through the pretense. Their presence disrupts the illusion not aggressively and not intentionally, but inevitably. And when someone who is deeply invested in their own carefully crafted self-image comes into contact with that kind of clear mirror, something very uncomfortable happens inside them. They feel exposed. Not exposed in a literal sense where all their secrets are revealed out loud for everyone to hear, but internally exposed in a way that shakes them. It is that unsettling feeling that someone nearby sees much more than you are currently showing them. It is the quiet realization that they understand something about you that you have not even fully admitted to yourself yet. And for many people, that exact feeling is deeply disturbing. Now, this is where the situation becomes psychologically fascinating, because most people do not respond to that discomfort by becoming curious about themselves. They do not pause to ask why they feel so suddenly seen right now, or what hidden part of themselves they might be actively avoiding. Instead, they completely externalize the experience. They look for a convenient source outside of themselves to blame for the sudden discomfort they are feeling. And the easiest, most accessible target is almost always the empath standing right in front of them. So, what begins as a silent internal recognition quickly turns into subtle, everyday resistance. Maybe it shows up as sudden dismissiveness in conversation. Maybe it takes the form of passive-aggressive comments that seem to come out of nowhere. Maybe it is just a swift shift in attitude that feels entirely disproportionate to anything you have actually said or done. From the empathic perspective, this reaction can feel incredibly confusing because there was no actual conflict, no direct confrontation, and no obvious external trigger to cause it. But the real trigger was never external at all. It was entirely internal. Your calm presence simply challenged something within them that they were not yet ready to face or heal. And this is exactly where resentment starts to take its subtle shape, not appearing as a loud or obvious emotion right away, but as something much quieter and more insidious. It builds slowly beneath the surface of the interaction. It gets heavily masked as casual indifference, sharp sarcasm, or even overly forced politeness. But underneath all of that exterior armor lies a very specific and predictable psychological dynamic. You represent a level of deep honesty and alignment that they are simply not living in harmony with at that moment in their lives. And people rarely resent what they do not notice. They deeply resent what constantly reminds them of what they are lacking. What makes this whole dynamic even more complex is that empaths will often try to overcompensate for this invisible tension. They sense the discomfort in the air even if they do not fully understand the mechanics behind it, and they try their best to soften their own presence. They try to become much more agreeable, far more accommodating, and excessively careful with every single word they choose to speak. They consciously try to dim their own awareness in a desperate attempt to make the other person feel safe and secure, but that approach never actually solves the root problem. Because the underlying issue was never really about what you said or what you did, it was always about what you simply represent by existing. You can never successfully negotiate with someone else's internal conflict. You can never manage their personal discomfort for them, no matter how hard you try. And the more you attempt to shrink yourself down to avoid triggering them, the more you reinforce a toxic dynamic where your own natural clarity becomes something you feel constantly responsible for hiding away from the world. That way of living is completely unsustainable. At a much deeper level, what is happening here is just as philosophical as it is psychological. Your light is not just about being emotionally attuned to the room. It is about being fundamentally aligned with truth. And truth has a very unique and unstoppable property of its own. It does not require any force or aggression to be disruptive to its surroundings. It simply exists as it is, and in doing so, it automatically challenges anything nearby that is not authentically aligned with it. So, when someone reacts negatively to your peaceful presence, it is almost never a true reflection of something you have done wrong. Most of the time, it is merely a mirror reflecting something inside them that they are simply not ready to look at clearly. And this realization represents a critical shift in your entire perspective. You finally stop trying so hard to fix their negative reaction, and you start actually understanding the underlying pattern at play. You stop taking on their internal discomfort as your own burden, and you start observing it with detached clarity. You realize that being labeled as too much, too intense, or way too aware is usually just another clumsy way of describing a level of human perception that quietly challenges the established status quo. And the honest truth is that not everyone is spiritually or emotionally ready for that level of depth. The primary goal, then, is never to reduce your natural awareness or dilute your powerful presence to make others comfortable. The goal is to fully understand the deep responsibility that naturally comes with having that level of perception. It is knowing when it is appropriate to engage, when it is wise to step back, and when to calmly accept the reality that not every environment or every single person you meet is capable of meeting you at that elevated level. Because true light does not just illuminate what is beautiful and comforting in the world, it also reveals what has been hidden in the dark. And not everyone resents the light simply because of what it is. Some people resent it purely because of what it forces them to see within themselves. If you look very closely at the recurring patterns in your relationships, you will quickly notice that empaths do not just attract healthy connections, they also attract heavy need. And there is a massive fundamental difference between those two things that most people do not recognize until it is far too late to change course. True connection is always entirely mutual. It is firmly grounded in mutual respect, equal reciprocity, and shared awareness. Need, on the other hand, is strictly one-directional and consuming. It constantly seeks immediate relief, external validation, and endless emotional supply from an outside source. And empaths, simply by their inherent nature and wiring, become highly visible beacons to anyone who is currently operating from that desperate place of internal need. This unfortunate outcome is never accidental. It is entirely structural. Empaths naturally tend to listen far more than they speak in social settings. They observe much more than they ever interrupt others. They validate feelings far more than they challenge them, at least during the early stages of a relationship. These positive traits unconsciously signal deep psychological safety to everyone around them. To a healthy, well-adjusted person, that kind of safety feels like the foundation of genuine trust. But to someone who is emotionally underdeveloped or internally unstable, that exact same safety feels like open access. And that feeling of unrestricted access is precisely where the dangerous dynamic begins to shift. Because when someone discovers that they can be deeply understood by you without ever having to do the hard work of understanding themselves, they immediately start to lean heavily on that external source. They begin to completely offload their baggage onto you. They bring all of their daily confusion, their unresolved frustrations, and their swirling emotional chaos right to your doorstep, and the empath almost instinctively receives it all. They do not do this out of any rigid sense of obligation, but purely out of their natural internal wiring. There is always a strong natural inclination inside an empath to help make sense of things, to bring a sense of clarity to the room, and to actively reduce emotional chaos wherever they find it. At the very beginning, this process can feel deeply meaningful to you. It feels like you have found a true purpose. It feels like you are genuinely making a measurable difference in someone else's difficult life journey. And in many different ways, you actually are helping them. But what almost always goes completely unnoticed in the process is the glaring lack of emotional balance. The exchange itself is completely unequal from the start. One person is constantly giving their precious energy, deep attention, and valuable insight away. The other person is merely consuming it all without giving anything substantial back. Now, in a truly healthy relationship dynamic, this sort of temporary imbalance would naturally correct itself over time. There would be a gradual shift toward true mutuality where both people contribute. The other person would eventually develop their own awareness, take full responsibility for their life, and begin to contribute emotionally in return. But in these unhealthy, draining dynamics, the exact opposite happens every single time. The more you give of yourself, the more they expect and take from you. And the more they take, the more they begin to rely on you, not as an equal human being, but merely as a functional resource. And that is precisely where something very subtle yet incredibly important occurs behind the scenes. Dependence slowly starts to breed a sense of quiet entitlement. What was once deeply appreciated in the beginning now becomes an expected standard. What was once received with genuine gratitude now morphs into something they feel they are naturally entitled to receive from you at all times. And when you inevitably reach a point where you simply cannot meet that exhausting expectation anymore, because no human being can sustain that high level of emotional output indefinitely, the entire tone of the relationship abruptly changes. This is the exact moment where resentment starts to form in full force, and it is usually the part that confuses empaths the most. Because from your honest perspective, nothing negative or harmful was ever introduced into the dynamic by you. You were consistently supportive. You were remarkably patient through their trials. You were fully present for them when they needed someone. So, when that other person suddenly becomes distant, hypercritical, or even openly hostile toward you, it feels completely disproportionate to reality. It feels like a massive shift that came entirely out of nowhere without any warning. But the truth is that it did not come from nowhere at all. It came directly from a deep psychological imbalance that had been slowly building beneath the surface over a long period of time. The other person did not just value what you generously gave to them, they secretly began to measure their own worth against it. And that constant comparison is inherently uncomfortable for them because your natural ability to process heavy emotions, to remain stable through storms, and to offer clear insight painfully highlights a massive gap. It exposes a gaping chasm in their own emotional capacity and maturity. And instead of using that newfound awareness as healthy motivation to grow and do their own inner work, many people respond by completely reframing the situation to protect their pride. They start to see your incredible strength not as something admirable, but as something threatening to them. Your remarkable consistency suddenly becomes too much for them to handle. Your profound insight gets dismissed as overanalyzing everything. Your deep emotional depth gets labeled as unhealthy intensity. These negative labels are not accurate descriptions of who you are at all. They are entirely defensive mechanisms. They are just a convenient way for them to reduce the deep discomfort that comes from recognizing something powerful in you that they do not yet possess within themselves. And when that lingering discomfort gets redirected outward, it is aimed squarely at you. So now the exact same qualities that initially attracted them to you in the beginning have magically become their primary source of daily irritation. It happens not because those core qualities of yours ever changed, but because their broken relationship to those qualities completely shifted. What once felt warm and supportive now feels far too exposing. What once felt grounding now feels entirely confronting. And here is the hard part of the truth that requires a level of clarity most empaths are initially very uncomfortable accepting. Some people are simply not drawn to you because they genuinely value who you are as a person. They are drawn to you solely because they deeply value what you can provide for them in their time of need. There is a massive functional difference between being truly appreciated for your soul and simply being used for your emotional labor, and that distinction usually reveals itself only over the course of time. This harsh reality does not mean that every single person who enters your life has genuinely malicious or harmful intentions toward you. In a vast majority of cases, their behavior is entirely unconscious. People simply operate from broken patterns that they do not fully understand themselves. They desperately seek relief wherever they can possibly find it. And when they finally encounter someone who has the rare ability to offer genuine emotional clarity, they naturally attach themselves to it like a lifeline. But unconscious behavior still carries very real consequences. And if you are not fully aware of this recurring pattern, you can easily spend a massive amount of your precious life energy overextending yourself in a futile attempt to maintain a dynamic that was never structurally designed to be sustainable in the first place. You end up giving even more of your heart, hoping against hope that it will somehow restore balance to the connection. You try to explain things even more clearly, hoping it will finally create mutual understanding. But the underlying architecture of the relationship never changes because it was fundamentally built on extraction rather than true exchange. So the ultimate question you must ask yourself is what you are going to do with this vital awareness moving forward. First, you must immediately stop interpreting constant draining need as deep emotional connection. They are two entirely different things that have nothing to do with each other. True depth is always measured by mutual investment, reciprocity, and shared respect, never by how heavily someone relies on you to carry their weight. Second, you need to start paying close attention to how people genuinely respond when their easy access to you is naturally limited. Do not remove yourself completely from their lives. Just gently limit the unlimited availability. Do they respond by becoming more respectful and self-aware of their own boundaries? Or do they instantly become frustrated, distant, sulky, or dismissive when they no longer get immediate supply? That honest response tells you absolutely everything you need to know about the true nature of the dynamic you are in. And finally, you must recalibrate your role in every relationship you maintain. You are not now, nor have you ever been, responsible for regulating other people's emotional states for them. You are certainly not obligated to serve as a 24/7 source of endless clarity whenever someone else chooses to stay lost in their own confusion. Your incredible ability to deeply understand others is a profound strength, but it is not an unlimited public resource that should ever be made available without firm, non-negotiable boundaries. Because when giving constantly becomes your default identity, you naturally attract people who are only looking to take from you. And if you do not define the strict limits of that exchange yourself, someone else will gladly do it for you. So the ultimate goal is never to stop being empathetic or to harden your heart. The goal is to become precise with how you apply it. It is about recognizing where your energy is genuinely valued, where it is mutually respected, and where it is merely being consumed. Because the exact moment you confuse being deeply needed with being truly respected, you step into a damaging dynamic where your personal value is no longer defined by who you actually are, but purely by how much of your life energy you are willing to give away. And that is not genuine connection at all. That is pure depletion. There is a very specific moment that almost every empath encounters in their journey, and it tends to arrive quite quietly at first. It is not dramatic, and it certainly is not announced with fanfare. It begins as a subtle internal realization that something about the way you have been engaging with people for years is simply no longer sustainable. You start to notice the stark imbalance in your relationships much more clearly. You begin to feel the crushing weight of your own constant availability. You realize with a start that your deep willingness to understand others has almost never been matched by their willingness to understand you in return. And from that fresh awareness, something profound begins to shift inside your mindset. You start setting firm boundaries, not as a form of petty punishment, and not as an angry reaction to past hurts, but simply as a clear form of self-preservation. You begin to say no in places where you used to instinctively say yes without a second thought. You pause and take a breath where you used to immediately rush in to fix things. You start questioning social dynamics that you previously accepted without any hesitation whatsoever. And most importantly, you completely stop overextending yourself in situations where your precious time and energy are not being respected. From your own perspective, this internal shift feels grounded, healthy, and entirely necessary. It feels like a long overdue correction to a flawed system. But from the perspective of someone who heavily benefited from your previous lack of boundaries, that exact same shift feels like something entirely different. It feels like a painful loss. And loss, especially when it is not understood or processed well, very often translates directly into defensive resistance. This is where the psychological tension between people becomes crystal clear, because boundaries do not just limit bad behavior, they fundamentally redefine how relationships work. They change the baseline terms of engagement. They introduce necessary structure where there was once completely open and unrestricted access. And for someone who has grown entirely accustomed to having that kind of unfettered access, the sudden introduction of limits can feel abrupt and harsh, even if those limits are objectively reasonable and fair. Now, here is the critical detail that most people miss entirely. People do not react to boundaries based on what the boundary actually is on paper. They react based on what that boundary takes away from their daily routine. If someone was completely used to having unrestricted emotional access to your time, your endless attention, and your bottomless patience, then even a very small and polite boundary can feel massive to them. It feels significant not because it is inherently unfair, but because it actively disrupts a comfortable pattern they had come to rely on for emotional survival. And when that familiar pattern is suddenly disrupted, it forces them to adjust their own behavior. But not everyone adjusts by becoming more self-aware. Some people adjust by putting up thick defensive walls. They begin to completely reinterpret your healthy behavior in a negative light. What used to be seen as your kindness and patience is now framed as inconsistency and coldness. What used to be deeply appreciated is now questioned with suspicion. You may start to hear phrases whispered or stated like you have changed, or you are just not the same person anymore, or even more subtle conversational variations that imply cold distance and emotional detachment. And in a very literal surface level sense, they are actually right. You have changed, but certainly not in the negative way they are trying to suggest. You have not suddenly become colder. You have simply become much more precise. You have not withdrawn your genuine care. You have just redefined how it is expressed to protect your peace. You have not become any less empathetic. You have simply become far more discerning about where that empathy is directed. The fundamental problem is that crucial distinction is rarely recognized by the other person, because from their limited perspective, the change in the relationship is strictly measured by access. And when that free access decreases, it is immediately interpreted as a personal rejection. This is where deep personal insecurity begins to surface to the top. Because boundaries do not just limit daily interaction, they introduce a high level of personal accountability. They require the other person to finally take a more active role in managing their own difficult emotions, their own unrealistic expectations, and their own behavior. And for someone who is completely unaccustomed to that level of personal responsibility, it can feel overwhelmingly uncomfortable. So instead of adapting internally and doing the hard work, they attempt to restore the previous dynamic through external pressure. They push back against your new boundary. Sometimes that pushback is direct, where they question it, challenge it, or try to aggressively negotiate around it. Other times it is entirely indirect, where they test the boundary subtly just to see if you will revert back to your old people-pleasing patterns under pressure. And in many cases, when those tactics ultimately fail to move you, the response turns heavily emotional. Frustration turns into sharp criticism. Mild discomfort turns into cold distance. And your hard-earned clarity becomes their primary target. This is the exact phase where many empaths experience a profound internal conflict because you can physically feel the heavy shift in the other person. You can sense the rising tension, the stubborn resistance, and the sudden change in their tone of voice. And there is a lingering part of you that desperately wants to restore the old harmony, to over-explain yourself, to soften the boundary just a bit, and to make the situation feel comfortable for them again. But that well-meaning instinct, while completely understandable, comes at a devastating personal cost. Because every single time you compromise a personal boundary just to preserve someone else's comfort, you reinforce a damaging dynamic where your own needs are pushed to the background. You send a clear signal both to them and to yourself that your limits are entirely flexible whenever enough pressure is applied. And once that toxic pattern is firmly established, it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain any form of consistency in your life. So the real challenge is never actually setting the initial boundary. The real challenge is holding the line. And holding that line requires a completely different kind of inner strength than most people expect. It is not loud, it is not aggressive, and it is not combative. It is quiet, steady, and consistent. It is the profound ability to tolerate someone else's discomfort without immediately rushing in to rescue them or resolve the tension for them. It is the willingness to let them have their own emotional reaction without taking personal responsibility for fixing it. That is precisely where the true shift happens in your life, because the moment you stop managing how other people feel about your healthy boundaries, you finally allow the true nature of the relationship to reveal itself to you. People who genuinely respect you will eventually adjust to the change. They may not like the inconvenience immediately, but they will recognize its validity and respect your needs. They will meet you with a level of understanding that clearly reflects their own internal stability. But people who are primarily benefiting from your historical lack of boundaries will struggle immensely. They will struggle not because your boundary is unreasonable, but because it removes something valuable they were never prepared to lose. And in the midst of that struggle, their true behavior becomes completely transparent. The hidden frustration, the quiet resentment, and the subtle attempts to regain control over you all become visible in the light. And that visibility is not a problem to be solved, it is valuable information. It tells you accurately who was genuinely connected to your soul and who was merely connected to your endless availability. Once you see that reality with complete clarity, your decisions become much more grounded and peaceful. You stop trying desperately to maintain every single relationship at the exact same level of intensity. You stop over-explaining your healthy limits to people who refuse to understand. You stop negotiating your own mental well-being just to preserve dynamics that were entirely unbalanced from the very beginning.